Start from time. I don't know how to work technology, so never mind. Just buzz me if I get too winded. And, oh, there's a clock right there. I know I feel stupid. So anyway, I'm just finishing up, my program at UTD, so on market. It's good to be here, by the way. I'm tickled pink, a little nerve-wracking, but thrilled to be here. This is, a little piece I like to call badges, bongs, bookies, brothels, police officer attitudes towards vice crime. Basically, this is just sort of a little, slightly condensed version of my dissertation. So a little background on vice crimes. So some behaviors are universally undesirable and therefore, regulated by the law. Things like murder, robbery, and burglary. They're universally bad. And therefore, they're worthy of some sanction of some sort. And in these transactions, there's always a victim and an offender. And that victim is subject to unwanted force or fraud, hence justification for sanction. However, some behaviors do not impart harmful force and fraud on an unwilling victim, but they're still criminalized. So no one is being harmed against their will, as in the case of a robbery, hence the term victimless crimes. These behaviors are criminalized because they're thought to express the public moral sentiment. Common of these include drug use, prostitution, and gambling. Contrary to more serious crimes, or victim crimes, there is no consensus about the appropriateness of legislating against these types of behaviors. So where the police come in, the police are tasked with enforcing law, including vice crime laws. They deal with these types of offenders every day. They arrest drug users, drug dealers, prostitutes and johns, gamblers, bookies. But the research on the vice police link is quite sparse, and most of the studies that do examine this relationship examine how police officers' attitudes are towards vice enforcement, not necessarily the vice behaviors themselves. One study was found that did directly explore police officer attitudes towards the vice behaviors and punitive attitudes towards behaviors, was the Wilson et al. Study. So Wilson, Colin, Matesson, and Wills, nearly 30 years ago. It's important to understand police officers' attitudes and perceptions. It's because these attitudes and perceptions, they influence police discretion. How police perceive things like crime race, criminal law, aspects about the offender, that influences how they behave on the job and how they treat people. So it could have, it could possibly have some meaningful policy implications to understand these behaviors and attitudes towards vice, especially in terms of police training. So there's definitely a need to have a more rich understanding about how police officers view vice and what factors influence those perceptions. So the purpose of this study was to refine and extend, replicate the Wilson et al. Study. So there's two goals to this research: to present a survey designed to measure attitudes towards vice and relevant covariates, and then to sample a large metropolitan police department and analyze data obtained by that instrument. So the overarching question operating under here is, how do officers perceive vice and what factors influence those perceptions? Specific research questions will be brought up in a little bit. Just a little background. When it comes to understanding and studying attitudes about vice, perceptions about vice, most of the research comes from general public samples. And long story short, basically what we learn is that there's a lot of variation in moral attitudes and how they relate to the law. So there's really no consensus when it comes to perceptions about vice and the appropriateness of criminalizing this behavior. National data suggests that there's a lot of people out there doing drugs, about 20 million a month. So this is indicative that Americans typically have a fairly lax view, or at least a subset of Americans have a lax view about drug use. Obviously, if people are using drugs, they probably don't have a very staunch negative perception about drugs. Research has shown that attitudes about drug use, there's a lot of variation, especially in terms of geography. So country to country, state by state, county by county, city by city, and probably even neighborhood by neighborhood. For example, Colorado and Washington legalized marijuana last year, and now we have Oregon and Alaska that just recently, and even Washington, D.C. Voting to legalize marijuana recently. California defelonized marijuana possession. And a recent Gallup poll has shown that now the majority of Americans support legalizing marijuana. That was not the case, not even close to the case as little as 15 years ago. So we see a lot of variation in geography and over time in attitudes towards drugs. Now, also, there's a fairly staunch political divide favoring legal pot. Liberals much more likely than conservatives to favor legalization. So perusing the literature on using general samples, religion is typically found to be a strong predictor of drug attitudes. So those who are more religious tend to have more negative views about drugs. And the same thing is found about attitudes towards prostitution. So those who are more religious tend to view prostitution more negatively. There's also a gender divide between attitudes about prostitution. So men are much more likely not only to buy prostitutes, but to think that there is nothing wrong with prostitution. There's even variation in the type of prostitution there is. So street prostitutes are viewed more negatively than call girl prostitutes. And even prostitutes themselves have different views about prostitution, where call girls typically report high levels of satisfaction, where so much is not the case with street prostitutes. Religion is also a strong predictor of gambling attitudes. Gambling attitudes have changed a lot in this country over the past century. So most states now have lottery. I believe 44 states have state lotteries. Several states have casino gambling. But nearly 100 years ago, gambling was almost universally banned. So we see a lot of shift in gambling attitudes. When it comes to negative attitudes towards gambling, they basically revolve around pathological gambling, addiction. Same thing what you see with like drug addiction or sex addiction. So Wilson et al., this was the only study that was found that directly examined police officers' perceptions of vice and punitive attitudes towards vice offenses. Now, they surveyed a small suburban police department in the Midwest. The sample consisted of 88 officers, and it was a homogeneous sample. It sounded like 97% of the sample was white males. So they couldn't decompose demographics, the effects of various demographics. A fact that they lamented, but you work with what you have. There was also very few controls in this study. They were only able to control for age, education, and experience with the vice unit. So even though this was an important study, an exploratory study that really served our knowledge base, there's room for improvement, and it's justifying a replication study. But what they found was that officers did not think that vice was a very serious problem in their area. However, they did believe that vice leads to more serious crime. The officers did not care to legislate morality, and they had a non-interventionist attitude, believing that they should not intensify the efforts to try to control crime in their area. But there was much variation found in their punitive towards vice offenses depending on the crime type. So, drug dealing was viewed more punitively than drug use, and it's kind of intuitive. Selling heroin was viewed more punitively than selling marijuana. Street prostitution was viewed more punitively than call girl prostitution. Buying a prostitute was viewed less punitively than being a prostitute, which was viewed as less punitive towards being a pimp. And then in multivariate models, the only significant predictor was age, where younger officers were less punitive than older officers towards vice offenses. So the instrument that Wilson et al. Used consists of two main batteries. One battery was a list of 9 items to measure general vice attitudes. And then there was another battery of items, 25 vice offenses used to measure punitiveness. Now, this is where, so in this section, in these 25 offenses, they asked the officers to respond which state intervention they thought would be appropriate for a given vice offense. And this instrument was used as a springboard to develop the instrument used in this research. So the items measuring general vice included things like vice leads to more crime, vice in the city is a serious problem, the city's police department is too overburdened to spend more resources trying to control vice crime activities, things of that sort. And here are the 25 vice offenses where they asked officers which state intervention would be appropriate given these offenses, and it ranged from like nothing, this should not be treated as a crime, all the way to 5 or more years in prison. You know, so selling heroin, selling cocaine, selling adult pornography, so various offenses, and then officers recorded how punitive they were by saying, well, selling marijuana, I think, you know, a 2-year sentence would be appropriate for that offense. So for the most part, the Wilson instrument was pretty good, really useful, but you know, it could use some modification. It could be improved. For example, double barrel questions could be split in 2 to reduce visual error, because it's possible respondents could agree to the first part of the question but disagree to the second part of the question. There are several items that could have been stated more clearly to reduce confusion. For example, what does vice lead to more serious crime? What does more serious crime mean? Things like robbery, burglary, and assault are more serious crimes that theoretically vice could lead to. Some of the items were dropped, you know, for example, child porn items were dropped because child porn isn't a victimless crime. Additionally, there were several more survey items included in the current instrument that were adapted from the drug attitude scale and the attitude towards prostitution scale to make the survey more nuanced, more thorough, and to develop typologies. You know, like not just vice in general, but let's create attitudes about the typologies of crime: drugs, prostitution, gambling. I used the standard 4-point Likert scale to measure vice seriousness attitudes. This was done to reduce the burden on respondents. Additionally, the standard 4-point Likert response scheme is, you know, the most common response scheme in survey research. And I used a 6-point intervention scale instead of an 8-point intervention scale to measure punitiveness attitudes, again to reduce the burden on respondents. And because the business of drugs, prostitution, and gambling often end in the police seizing assets related to those activities, I included some measures about attitudes towards asset forfeiture favorability. So the current survey also included many more covariates and controls. So we measured tenure at the police department, job satisfaction, rank, assignment to the vice narcotics unit, tenure at the vice narcotics unit, family status, being married or having children, political ideology, religion, commitment to religion, age, gender, and ethnicity. So turning to the research questions. Number 1, what factors influence officers' perceptions of vice in general? Number 2, what factors influence officers' perceptions of drug offense seriousness? What factors influence their punitive attitudes towards drug offenses? Is there a relationship between their perceptions of drug offense seriousness and their punitive attitudes towards drug offenses? And what factors moderate that relationship? So you can kind of see this, there's a stepwise pattern to build the final model. And research questions 3 and 4 are the exact same as number 2, but substitute prostitution, gambling for drugs, respectively. And then the 5th research question, is there a relationship between perceptions of vice-related offense measures and measures of asset forfeiture favorability? So this instrument offers us another way to investigate the bias and asset forfeiture link. So the data come from sworn officers at a large police department in a southern metro city. I'll leave that up to imagination to what department that is. Access to this sample was accomplished by working with a deputy chief. So this deputy chief was a gatekeeper. Due to the constraints put on this research by the deputy chief, a probability sampling method wasn't possible, so I'm left with a convenient sample. The surveys were administered via SurveyMonkey. The invitations to participate in this project were sent from the official city email from the deputy chief. Now, all the language was provided by me, but sent through the deputy chief's office. And this was a one-time shot, so the data are cross-sectional. To maximize response rates, use the total design method for survey research as described by Dillman. So there's 3 emails sent to the officers by the deputy chief. All of the content was provided by me. So the first step was to announce the project. Second step was to invite the officers to participate. Then the third step was to thank those who participated, and then re-invite those who had not to take the survey. So the 3,500 sworn officers of the police department, 314 responded to the survey for a response rate of 9%. Now this is low. 9% is a really low response rate. However, it's sort of common to see low response rates amongst police officer samples. They're notorious for being hard to work with. Additionally, we can still learn something with study with low response rates. I mean, the data are still useful, and they do have their limitations, but they are useful. For example, Mazerall et al. Recently published a piece in our flagship journal, Criminology, with a response rate of 13%. So we can they're still useful. Missing data was dealt via list-wise deletion. 50 of the respondents, about 50 respondents, dropped within the first 8 questions of taking the survey. So attrition is a common limitation among survey research. There's really not much you can do about it. And in these situations, imputation procedures are not effective. However, those who did finish the survey rarely did not answer every single question. So they amounted to just a handful of cases. And in these cases, list-wise deletion was used in multivariate models. So for a multivariate model, we have a grand sample size ranging from 206 to 235 respondents. So the sample is non-probabilistic. It is a convenient sample. And there was some disproportionate representativity from the respondents to the population of officers based on ethnicity, rank, and education. As such, the data were weighted via the inverse probability weight. So the measures. Created a cadre of latent factor variables via factor analysis. These all represent single factor solutions. So the latent factors include a general attitudes towards vice seriousness, attitudes towards drug seriousness, attitudes towards prostitution seriousness, attitudes towards gambling seriousness, punitiveness towards drug offenses, punitiveness towards prostitution offenses, punitiveness towards gambling offenses, and attitudes towards asset forfeiture favorability. These variables are used both as independent and dependent variables, but just how they're used will be explained in a little bit. Again, the survey items were used to create latent factors, and factor scores were created, so we have continuous measures. Again, the response options to measure the vice seriousness and asset forfeiture favorability was a standard 4-point Likert scale. And then the measuring punitiveness attitudes, the response options were a 6-point state intervention scale. So nothing in this offense should not be dealt with as a crime is coded as 1, all the way up to 6, where officers believe that a long-term incarceration of more than a year would be appropriate given that vice offense. So to measure general bias attitudes, these items are very similar to the items from the Wilson study, but they've been massaged a little bit. So bias leads to more serious crime like burglary, robbery, assault. Bias in the city is a serious problem. Morality should be legislated. The police department is too overburdened to spend more resources trying to control vice activities, things of that nature. So there was a laundry list of items measuring drug seriousness attitudes, including the war on drugs is reducing drug use. It is wrong for people to use drugs to reduce anxiety, stress, tension. The use of marijuana is more dangerous than using alcohol. There's nothing wrong with drug use. Drug use is a serious problem in the city. Involvement with drugs leads to more serious crime, things of that nature. Along similar scales, prostitution was seriousness was measured very similarly. Items like, there's nothing wrong with prostitution. Most prostitutes are lazy, trashy. We need tougher laws to fight prostitution. Involvement with prostitution leads to more serious crime. Measuring gambling seriousness attitudes, again, very similarly, like there's nothing wrong with underground gambling. Involvement with underground gambling leads to more serious crime. And these are the items used to measure drug punitiveness attitude. So again, the officers were asked which state of sanction is appropriate given these vice offenses. So selling marijuana for profit, using marijuana for profit, or using marijuana. I don't know how you use marijuana for profit. I don't know if those jobs exist. And these are the items used to measure prostitution punitiveness. So, what officers thought would be an appropriate sanction for street prostitution or buying a street prostitute. And then measuring gambling punitiveness, loan sharking, running an underground gambling, depending on sports. And these were the items I came up with to measure asset forfeiture attitudes. As far as I know, there are no standard measures to measure asset forfeiture attitudes, so this is a novel attempt. So asset forfeiture is a good way to supplement the police department's budget. Asset forfeiture laws encourage policing for profit, things like that. So the KMO statistics suggest that the latent factors are pretty good measures. There's a couple in here that they're not the best, but they're still usable. So tenure range 1 to 42 years, with a mean of 16 years. So police officers tend to be at the department for quite a while. There were 4 chiefs, 1 captain, 14 lieutenants, 64 sergeants, 141 senior corporal or detectives, and 86 line officers in the sample. 30 were currently assigned to the Vice Narcotics Unit, 74 had experience in the Vice Narcotics Unit. For the most part, officers were satisfied with their job in law enforcement. Age ranged from 25 to 70, mean age of 42 years. There were 188 white officers, 25 black officers, 37 Hispanic, and 8 others. 42 female, 250 male. 189 officers were married, 190 had children, 22 had some college, 135 had a bachelor's degree, 22 had some graduate school, 27 had a master's degree, and 5 respondents had earned a PhD. There were 19 self-identified liberals, 58 in the middle of the road independents, and a bunch of conservatives, as you would expect in the police department in Texas. There were 213 Christians, 14 identified as spiritual, not religious. There were 13 atheists or agnostics. There's 1 Jew, 1 Muslim, and 2 Mormons. So the analytical strategy. So summary and descriptive statistics, histograms, correlation matrices, and multivariate models. So to answer the first research question, estimate an OLS model predicting general vice attitudes. And then research questions 2 through 4 are very similar, but drug, prostitution, and gambling respectively, and they're in a stepwise fashion to build the model. So the first step was to estimate an OLS model of the vice seriousness attitudes, then estimate a model of their punitiveness attitudes, then to estimate a model where the punitive attitudes were treated as a dependent variable and the vice seriousness attitudes were treated as the independent variable, holding all other things constant. And then several interaction terms were created and included into the model individually to test for moderating effects. And then the 5th research question was investigated by estimating a series of OLS models predicting asset forfeiture attitudes where that was an independent or dependent variable, and the vice-related offense measures were treated as independent variables. They were all included into the model individually. And lastly, the proper diagnostics were done to assess regression assumptions. So officers in this sample tend to have fairly serious and punitive views towards vice. They view drug offenses as more serious and more punitive than prostitution offenses, and prostitution offenses were viewed as more serious and more punitive than gambling offenses. Officers from this sample had a very interventionist attitude, believing that more can and should be done to control vice. Officers were overwhelmingly supportive of asset forfeiture. They felt that these practices run a low risk of unethical decisions on the part of police officers. And then they also did not feel that asset forfeiture did not encourage that policing was for profit. But there are several pieces of literature to suggest that the policing for profit thesis is fairly supportive. So this is a table showing the results of the OLS regression model predicting general vice seriousness attitudes. So here we see that years in vice narcotics is significant. So more experience in the vice or narcotics unit is associated with higher, or views that treat general vice more seriously. Job satisfaction was reverse coded, so it's more intuitive to interpret this as job dissatisfaction. So officers who were less satisfied with their job viewed general vice less seriously. Political ideology, so more liberal officers, officers who were more liberal viewed general vice less seriously. Males viewed general vice less seriously compared to female officers. And Hispanics viewed general vice more seriously than white officers. This is a table of OLS regression estimates estimating drug seriousness attitudes. Here we see ever having been in vice was associated with a decrease in drug seriousness attitudes. So this is kind of different from the previous model where more experience in the vice or narcotics unit was associated with a positive or an increased view in vice seriousness. But having ever served in a vice capacity was associated with a decrease. And the effect side is quite modest. Beta negative 0.2, which, as you'll see in pretty much the entire analysis, is about the largest effects that I find. Officers who were more educated and officers who were more liberal viewed drug use less seriously, and officers who were less committed to their religion viewed drugs less seriously. So this is a table showing the output estimating drug punitiveness act. And here we see that officers who were more educated and officers who were more liberal viewed drug offenses less punitive, or had less punitive attitudes towards drug offenses. So this is an OLS regression model estimating the relationship between drug seriousness attitudes and drug punitiveness attitudes. And as expected, there's a strong relationship there, holding all other things constant. But even officers who were, even in this model, officers who were more liberal still tend to view drug offenses less punitively. You see, all the interaction terms were run separately, but included in the table contemporaneously, to save space. But you see that none of the interaction terms were significant. So, like the relationship between drug seriousness attitudes and drug punitive attitudes was stable and unmoderated by any of the factors included, or any of the measured items. So, moving on to prostitution. This is a table estimating the prostitution seriousness attitudes. So here we see that having ever been in vice was associated with decrease in prostitution seriousness, but experience years in the vice narcotics unit was associated with an increase in prostitution seriousness attitudes, and those effect sizes were very similar. Officers who were less satisfied with their job and older officers viewed prostitution less seriously, as did officers who were less committed to their religion, and as did male officers as compared to female officers. So officers who were more or less satisfied with the job viewed prostitution offenses less punitively, as did officers who were more educated and more liberal-leaning, as well as male officers. So this is an OLS model estimating the relationship between prostitution seriousness attitudes and prostitution punitiveness. And as expected, there was a strong relationship between those. And the same covariates were significant in this model as in previous models. But turning your attention to the interaction terms, there were two interaction terms that were significant. Male interacting with prostitution seriousness attitudes and education interacting with prostitution seriousness attitudes. So what this shows is that the relationship is moderated by gender, by education, where the relationship was actually stronger for males and females, and it was stronger for the less educated officers compared to more educated officers. So moving on to gambling attitudes. Officers that were less satisfied with the job viewed gambling less seriously, Additionally, officers who were more liberal viewed gambling less seriously, and officers who were male and officers who were white viewed gambling less seriously. Very similarly, the same variables predicted gambling punitiveness attitudes. So officers who were less satisfied, more liberal, more educated, and male viewed gambling offenses unpunitive. So estimating the relationship between gambling serious attitudes and gambling punitive attitudes, as expected, there was a strong relationship between these two. In this model, there was something pretty interesting that's really hard to explain. Being married predicted more punitiveness attitudes, but having children predicted less punitive attitudes. I don't know how to explain that. I mean, it could be a statistical fluke, because several models were run, but that just sort of blew my mind. So I have no idea how to explain that. But you see here that relationship has been unmoderated by measured factors. None of the interaction terms were significant. So this table shows the regression estimates between the relationship of asset forfeiture favorability and the vice-related attitude measures. All of the vice-related measures were included into the model individually, but shown here simultaneously to save space. So several of the covariates, some of the usual suspects were significant predictors of asset forfeiture favorability. So officers were less satisfied, and older officers were less favorable towards asset forfeiture, as were officers who were more liberal and less committed to their religion. But of the vice-related factors, only the drug seriousness factor and the drug punitiveness factor were related to asset forfeiture favorability. And the relationship was positive and quite, marginal and modest. So officers from this sample had fairly serious and punitive views about vice. They overwhelmingly believed that vice was a serious problem in their city, and that could help explain why they had such serious and punitive views. They overwhelmingly believed that vice leads to more serious crime. Unexpectedly, however, was that police characteristics played a small role in this analysis. Rank was never significant. It was thought that officers who were on the street would have different attitudes than the officers who were pencil pushers behind the desk in the precinct or in the headquarters. But that wasn't the case from this analysis. Also, experience with the vice and narcotics unit played a smaller role than anticipated. And additionally, the findings were fairly inconsistent. For example, tenure in vice was typically associated with an increased view of seriousness and punitiveness towards vice, but just having experience in the vice or narcotics unit was associated with a decrease. I mean, the average tenureship in vice and narcotics was just over a year. So officers from this sample tend to not be in vice and narcotics unit very long. So it could be the case that officers who simply just have experience in the vice and narcotics unit, they feel that they see that maybe we're spending precious criminal justice sources fighting crimes that really aren't that serious, because there are serious crimes in this city. I mean, it's typically in the top 10 most dangerous cities. However, officers who come to the plate, there might be a selection effect. Officers who come to the plate with preconceived notions about vice that are more serious, they may have like a moral crusade to fight against moral-based crimes. So that may be why we see the inconsistent different effects between tenure in vice and narcotics and just having experience in vice and narcotics. The effect of religion and religious commitment was also surprisingly not an important factor in this analysis. Going back to the literature review, religion is typically a strong predictor of vice attitudes, but that wasn't really the case so much here in this analysis. The go-tos, the usual suspects was political ideology and education. Those were the two most common and powerful predictors of these attitudes, and they had similar effects in the same direction, and that's kind of expected because research has shown that liberals tend to be more educated and vice versa. Also, there was some variation in gender. Men were less punitive and less serious towards prostitution and gambling. Like, makes sense. Men gamble more. Men buy prostitutes more often. And younger officers tended to be less punitive. This might be indicative of a more progressive culture. And as expected, ethnicity had little effect in this analysis. Vice offenses, especially drug use, are evenly distributed within ethnic groups, so it wasn't expected that ethnicity would have a huge effect. Job dissatisfaction played a big role, and that was unexpected. This may be due to cynicism officers experience in the job. Officers might realize that we're spending all this time and all these resources fighting vice offenses, and this is fighting the wrong fight. We should be fighting things like robbery and murder, more serious crimes. Moderators played a very little role. Only gender and education moderated the relationship in the prostitution model. Experience with the Vice Narcotics Unit didn't interact, and this was surprising. I thought it for sure would, because you would expect that having experience with the Vice Narcotics Unit would affect that relationships between attitudes of drug seriousness and attitudes towards drug punitiveness and so on, but that wasn't the case. Officers were overwhelmingly in favor of asset forfeiture, and there was a moderate and positive relationship between asset forfeiture favorability and drug seriousness and punitive attitudes. So officers may feel that asset forfeiture is a valuable crime-fighting tool to help fight the war on drugs, help offset the cost for fighting the war on drugs, might be an effective deterrent, because people don't want their stuff taken. Like people can lose houses, money, cars, the bling bling they have around their necks from asset forfeiture. But also, they can also enjoy the fruits of their labors. Officers get to enjoy those benefits. They reap the rewards of those assets seized. In comparison with the Wilson study, there was a lot of differences. So the sample here had much more punitive and serious attitudes. And this is probably because in the Wilson study, the officers didn't see that vice was a serious problem in their city, but this sample, overwhelmingly, the sample viewed that vice was a serious problem in the city. And that the officers from this sample had a much more interventionist attitude, believing that more can and should be done to control vice. And time, geography, and city context might help explain these differences. 30 years differentiate the two. This sample comes from the South. The Wilson sample comes from the Midwest. And the Wilson sample was a suburb. And this sample comes from a big metro city. The instrument used in this research, it was an improvement on the Wilson instrument, but it's still imperfect and there's definitely room for improvement, better measurement. As with all studies, this is not without fault. First is measurement. So a couple of the latent factors had some pretty low KMO statistics. It's not surprising that the asset forfeiture measure had a low KMO. This was a novel approach, and looking back at it now, I can think of several items I could, better that measurement. And always strive for better measurement. Limit the error, limits the bias. Additionally, the sample is one of convenience. The data are cross-sectional, so we can't make any generalizations or any sort of causal inferences. Additionally, there's certainly omitted variable bias. R squares range from 8% to 44% of the variance explain the dependent variable. So there are things out there that were unmeasured that are influencing these attitudes, and those were left unmeasured and out of the model. But the most significant limitation is the response rate. 9% is pretty low. Like even uncharacteristically low, even for police samples that are typically around 20%. But again, data are still useful. We can still learn something about them. We can still learn something from it. It still informs us for future research, even policy decisions. So low response rates, they shouldn't, the data shouldn't be abandoned. So in the future, the instrument could be refined and tested in the future. Again, strive for better measurement. than the bias. Additionally, we could use vignette-based designs to investigate the relationship between police officer attitudes towards bias and their discretion in decision-making processes. Additionally, we can include measures regarding race and neighborhood context to see how those relationships moderate, or see how these factors moderate the relationship between police officers' attitudes towards bias and their decision-making and use of discretion. Additionally, replication. It's a key idea in science. So it'd be useful to sample different police departments in different areas, large police departments, medium, small, sheriff's officers, or even the feds. And that way we can start to decompose, city context, police department context, geographic context, and see how those effects influence police officers' attitudes towards bias. So in conclusion, this is the first known replication of the Wilson study. Like I said earlier, respondents had fairly serious punitive attitudes. They had more interventionist attitudes. The relationship between the bias seriousness and bias punitiveness attitudes were strong and largely unmoderated, so they were very stable effects. Officers favor asset forfeiture, and this is an understudied topic. They could have important ramifications for policy, and more importantly about police discretion, because it's important that we know how or what things influence how the police do their job. We know that these perceptions influence police discretion and how they do their job. And so, for example, consistent and fair policing is an important factor for their legitimacy. So citizens, they give the police department legitimacy when they deliver us procedural justice, and part of that is, fair, consistent policing. But, a small-time drug offender over here and a small-time drug offender over here might experience completely different outcomes simply based on the preconceived notions about drugs on the part of the officers they dealt with. And that sort of could influence unfair policing and decrease police legitimacy. So it'd be a good idea to make officers aware that, hey, your perceptions influence how you do your job. So it could be the fact that how you view drugs is going to influence how you react to drug offenders. And we should, it would be a good idea to remain objective and to try to leave your subjective biases, at home. So we have more effective, more consistent, more fair policing. That's all I have. So I'll take your barrage of questions.
Did you have any idea from the department what the policy was in terms of, so talking about explaining the difference between the years in vice versus have ever been in vice and the difference in views on seriousness? Was this a department where officers were rotated through assignments on, like a biannual basis? Was it one where it was like application to assignments?
I'm not sure, I have no idea. But from what I know about this police department, it's more likely the latter, where they volunteer.
Okay, because that would just be really interesting. I know sometimes there's a rotation. I think
Yeah.
usually sometimes with smaller departments.
Yeah.
But it would be interesting to kind of see if that has something to do, are the ones that have been in vice, did they leave because they had these attitudes and didn't view it as serious?
Or they got assigned to the gang unit or something else.
Right, yeah. So that would be kind of an interesting component to look at, the policy effect on those attitudes, or the interaction with the policy and those attitudes.
I think inherently police time in vice is short as well. I think it's kind of a stepping stone to other positions. I think that's just kind of also a factor.
Yeah, again, like the average time was just over a year.
Yeah, I mean, my husband's in law
Another
enforcement. I know that with our cop friends, it's always kind of like, oh, we have to do vice, but then we can't wait to get out of it. Because it's a high burnout. Because, like you said, one of your findings was that, when they're in it, they realize that they just can't do anything about it. It's just use our resources in other places. It's just they feel like they can't do anything to fix the problem because it's so.
In the descriptives, there was 100 items, so I didn't include everything.
Right.
But one of the measures was drug, prostitution, gambling offenses will exist regardless of law enforcement activities.
Right.
90% agreement, like over 90% agreement, you know, so it's like officers feel that what they're doing is futile. Even though it's like they have to do it, it's their job, you know, 70% of all arrests are vice arrests, so it's like they're spending the vast majority of their time dealing with public order offenders. But they also feel that nothing we can do is going to change anything. They also feel that, you know, we need stronger laws. They're very punitive and very, you know, like the sort of modal response was more law enforcement. So it's sort of, it's kind of weird to juxtapose to. They felt more laws, harsher laws, and more law enforcement is needed, but nothing they can do will affect it. So, yeah, it kind of bakes your noodle a little bit.
It is, especially since a lot of law enforcement, don't they go in, or cops go into law enforcement because they want to help people. I mean, kind of that public service type position.
yeah,
And so when they find out, what am I doing? This is not making it's not having an impact. You can see why it'd be a high turnover. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, they should be cognitively dissonant, just like our legislators should be, but they never realize it.
Absolutely.
I'm curious about the punitiveness scale for each one of those different vice offenses. I know it went from kind of do nothing to long-term incarceration. What were some of the descriptives for that, for those three different offenses? What were the typical responses from the officers in terms of what they thought were appropriate sentences for those crimes?
A lot of variation, and depends on the vice offense. But for example, you know, like the majority of officers believe that just simple drug possession or drug use doesn't warrant incarceration. You know, just like a simple fine, they're okay with that. But you know, for example, meth. You know, they want to put people in jail for having meth, for using meth. So you see a lot of like the softer drugs are more lenient, the harsher drugs are more punitive. Same thing when it comes to selling versus using. They were very punitive about selling. You know, like the distribution was actually a little skewed to the right when it comes to selling drugs. So they were very punitive about selling drugs. But all the other offenses, you know, vice offenses, they're, you know, fairly punitive, more punitive than, you know, the general research from general population, more punitive than the Wilson piece. But, you know, for example, like the overwhelming majority of officers believe that, you know, betting on sports shouldn't be a crime. You know, so, which is interesting, like in the city where this was done. You know, it's very common to bet on sports at the bar. You know, and about 2 or 3 years ago, you know, a SWAT team went in and raided, you know, a little group of friends in their basement, betting on games. You know, so additionally, prostitution. Fairly punitive, but not like excessively. You know, again, like short-term incarceration, not necessarily long-term incarceration. They thought, you know, they were much more punitive towards the supply side or the demand side than the supply side. So the Johns got the worst end of it. So they were more punitive towards the Johns than the prostitutes themselves. Additionally, like age was a factor. You know, like they viewed, you know, juvenile prostitution much more negatively than and punitively than adult prostitution. Same thing with street and Culver. You know, like street prostitution was much more harsh towards street versus Culver. You know, where you know we want to put street prostitutes in jail, but we're just going to slap a wrist on Culver prostitutes, things like that.
Did the gambling measures include anything about lottery usage or no?
No, that's probably an oversight.
Well, no, I was going to try to resolve your child versus marriage issue. Because if there were lottery measures, then I would say it was because the lottery funds go into the education system.
Yeah.
And that would explain the difference between married people without kids versus married people with kids. But if that wasn't in there, then that doesn't help at all.
I didn't even think about that. I mean, because, you know, kids aren't on my radar at all. You know, what do I know about it? As far as I know, they're just terrible people. But
Maybe it just has to do with expenses, Lane. If you have kids, I'm taking any opportunity I can to make more money.
Right.
Exactly.
I won't make $10
Get
a
away
year.
from home,
That's
I have to
right.
go sell.
But think for future revisions, I'm gonna put, something about lottery in there. I think that's a good idea, actually.
I think it's really interesting because I think a lot of people don't even equate that with gambling. So it would
Yeah,
be
yeah,
interesting to
yeah.
see
Yeah, when they
differences
see
in
when they-
opinions about that.
The connotation of gambling is at casinos or back alley playing street craps, things like that. But lottery, gambling, yeah, probably right.
Were there any policy and practice implications for the department that was involved in this, in terms of, at the end of the process, you said to them, this is what I found, and this is how you can use this moving forward? Was there anything like that that came out of the research?
I haven't gotten that far yet.
Okay,
When I turn this into actual, something that's digestible,
mhm,
something that's not, 100 and some odd pages,
yeah,
then, like, obviously, like, in the end of the articles, there's gonna be your policy implications paragraphs.
yeah,
So, when those things get out and disseminated, the Caruth Police Institute is a research and leadership institute that's housed at DPV.
yeah.
And so and one of our graduates is a director there.
Mhm.
So a lot of the research that gets published and done at DPV sort of is there and available at Caruth, and the brass come in and they check things out. Back when I started, doing this process, like, I'll let you know how things turn out, what I find. Now, kind of come full circle, it's been almost 2 years. I started this idea when I was working at Caruth, my first year in the PhD program. So that's how I kind of got the idea and had access to the police department and those officers. So eventually, that information will be there, and, communicate that to the deputy chief. So we'll see what happens.
In terms of the response rate, and because I'm not very familiar with like general practices and policing research and surveying departments, is it common to have, like if it's an email survey, to have the request go through, was it the chief of police who was your?
Deputy chief, yeah,
Deputy chief.
one of the deputy chiefs.
So is that kind of like a common practice? Do you think that having it come from that would have hurt or helped
I
the
definitely think it hurt.
response rate?
I think it hurt, because, we know from general populations that, actual paper in people's hands increases response rate over web-based, internet-based. That divide is changing, there is a shift there, but, manual paper and pencil still gets better response rates. But the thing is, I didn't have those resources, I didn't have the money to print all these surveys, but even when, those mail-based methods are used, you still get terrible response rates from police officers. Usually right around 20%. That's sort of the standard, I guess you call it. But I definitely think if I had a little bit more political capital and economic capital, I could have increased those response rates somewhat. But I think it would be a pipe dream to get anything over, 30 or 40, even with all the resources available.
Do you think the officers were concerned about confidentiality with it coming directly from their superior?
It was pretty, like the statement of purpose, it was very clear. It's like,